I need to leave here thinking differently and acting differently. Don't lie to yourself about what you're homeschooling now. Because some of y'all are home fooling the hell around. What am I talking about?
On the streets and helping bring rights and stuff to the people.
Black kids outperform the children of every other cultural IQ test up until age 5. As a holistic health practitioner, are you the proper person to homeschool your own child?
Well, thank you, Mrs. Williams, and thank you for organizing this conference here and this event. And thank you for your forthright statement just now and elsewhere. We need more parents, and we need more citizens to stand up and speak out and to take a stand on these issues and organize events like this one, because this problem is truly out of hand. And the people that are paying for it, of course, are all of us, our children, of course, the parents, the families of this country, but not just that. Our budgets are paying for it, our stability of our society, the financial solvency of our society, our political system, and so forth. So I'll talk to you about that a little bit now. My field is politics, and if you want to understand what is harming the children today, we have to confront the politics. Yes, there are many cultural problems. There are, there's popular culture, there's technological developments, social media and smartphones and so forth. But we can't allow these to become excuses for not dealing with the problem, with the political aspect of the problem, the role of our government, and the violation of our basic constitutional rights, which it represents. What many of you have experienced and what we've seen in the film here is part of a pattern. Right? The pattern is getting larger. The pattern is spreading. It's been developing for many years under the radar screen of the media. We're seeing it today. Most recently, part of this pattern is now extended to what we see today in the Me Too phenomenon. And it's broken out there into the open where we can see, the world can see much of the politics behind it. Politics today has an obsession, if I may say so. The obsession is sex. And this is always connected with the larger issues of family and children, much as we might pretend otherwise. And we are increasingly today, politics is being dominated by various accusations involving sexuality and involving children, involving families, of much the kind like you've seen here, but they are spreading into other areas. We've seen it recently in the case of Judge Kavanaugh in the Supreme Court. We've seen it in the case of figures like Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein and the football player Ronaldo. Before these accusations, before it hit the public media, we saw there was an epidemic of sexual accusations against university students, mostly of rape, virtually all of which turned out to be complete fabrications at best and hoaxes at worst. Before that, we had an outbreak of epidemic of accusations about domestic violence, which is still going on, mostly against fathers in divorce cases. Most of these were, and still are, false. And before that, of course, we had an epidemic of various epidemics of accusations of child abuse against parents and others, virtually all of which turned out to be false. So you can start to see the pattern here. This epidemic has a common denominator that I want to talk about, a common root, and that common root, one of the common roots at least, you saw in the film, one of the common roots is financial, and I don't mean to discount that at all. But another common root that it has is political ideology. We have seen today a secular, sexual political ideology. Unlike political ideologies of the past, socialism, communism, fascism, this one seeks to use sexuality as a weapon to acquire political power. This ideology has many facets. It is hostile to men in many ways, and fathers in particular. It's hostile to parents generally. It's hostile often to heterosexuality and to religious faith. One of its basic premises is the separation of sexuality from marriage and from the family. When sex takes place outside of marriage, we see, on a large scale at least, we see a number of connected ills. One of them, most obviously, which we've seen for years, is the huge numbers of children growing up in single-parent homes or in foster care, without fathers, sometimes without mothers. This has been increasing for decades and is hitting the crisis point, long past the crisis point. But nowadays, we're also seeing another fallout from this development, and that is sexual irregularities. Traditionally, we called these sins. We called them fornication, adultery, cohabitation, divorce. But then we were told that there was nothing wrong with these practices and that we shouldn't stigmatize them. So instead of fornication, adultery, cohabitation, and divorce, we found new names for them. We were told we must stigmatize them, especially when they are committed by men. We call them sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual this, and sexual that. In other words, we have new sins, or more accurately, perhaps, new crimes substituted for the old ones. So it shouldn't surprise us that parents have become the targets of sexual accusations of abuse of their children, false ones. And it should surprise us all less so when we see that those accusations, this has been happening, in fact, larger and for a longer period of time within the context of the family. Specifically, family courts and the social service agencies, as we've seen. In other words, this is the concrete common denominator behind all of this phenomenon of accusations. Much of it takes place over child custody in various forms, whether it's in the courts or the social service agencies. But much of this was pioneered with families like yours. This is where much of where it started. My previous book was about this and focused narrowly on this question of family courts and social service agencies. My more recent book has dealt with the larger issue of accusations in the larger political context, fabricated quasi-criminal accusations. Again, it started with child abuse. More recently, it involved domestic violence, rape as well. There's a similar modus operandi between all of these phenomena. They seldom involve formal charges, let alone jury trials. Still less do they involve convictions in courts. There's almost never any evidence that such a crime was ever committed, because in most cases no such crime was ever committed. And yet there is no presumption of innocence. There are other protections of due process of law. The purpose, of course, is not to punish a crime. The purpose is to win custody or ownership of the children and to remove them from their parents altogether. The result is that to leave millions of children needlessly fatherless by depriving them of perfectly fit and loving fathers, or motherless in some cases, even when they've committed no legal wrongdoing, either criminal or civil, literally no fault of their own. This has been common knowledge for years, and yet virtually zero effort has been made against the obviously intolerable situation whereby courts of justice are used to administer injustice, and that knowingly false accusations are being used against legally innocent citizens. Most recently, we saw this again. It's not surprising that the success of this method of achieving power has spread elsewhere to the society to the point where a nominee to the Supreme Court is almost derailed because of accusations which no one can prove. Whether Judge, and I will add here, that whether Judge or not Judge Kavanaugh is guilty of sexual assault, I certainly think that he is guilty of presiding over a justice system that routinely and knowingly dispenses injustice. So the bottom line here is that the crisis of fatherless children, that shows no signs of abating, is not surprising because the elites are in the business of fabricating their own accusations against innocent people. In fact, in many ways, their livelihood depends upon propagating false accusations against innocent parents who have no platform to speak in their own defense. Another of these is the accusation that parents whose children have been forcibly taken from them by the courts or the social service agencies through, again, literally no fault of their own, have voluntarily abandoned those children and refused to support them because they don't or can't empty their pockets to the child support enforcement agencies. Okay? With this accusation, as with the other crimes, again, and they too are accused of being deadbeat dads. And this, like the other accusations, there's often not a shred of evidence against them, and they also don't receive any due process protections. They're simply summarily incarcerated without trial. I will add further, I won't go into details about this, but I think if we dig a little deeper into this, we will also find yet another common denominator behind all of these phenomena, whether it's mothers or fathers or parents together, and that is the welfare state. This will touch some nerves among many people. I know that we've never really had an honest and forthright debate about the welfare state. And I think one is long overdue. There's many people, economists, from an economic standpoint, will tell you that the welfare state is too expensive, we can't afford it, and it's bloated. There's been fewer people have voiced the objection, the more substantive objection, that not only is the welfare state expensive, it's also destructive. We are paying large amounts of money to turn our children into criminals, truants, and substance abusers in many ways. How the welfare state creates single-parent homes is well known, and there's no need to dwell on that. It's only worth adding that these fatherless communities are the breeding grounds for crime, substance abuse, and virtually every social pathology in our society today. And if you go to Europe, you could add to that list terrorism. What's less well known is how the welfare state has directly led not only to the real criminality, but also to the criminalization of innocent citizens, especially parents. The welfare state now administers its own specialized gendarmeries, police forces, which is a vast underworld of unaccountable police power that most journalists and scholars like me find too dreary to scrutinize until it touches their own lives. I'm talking here about the world of social work, child protection, child and family counseling, child support enforcement, juvenile and family courts, forensic psychotherapy, and the public school system. These officials that run this machinery are effectively quite plainclothes quasi-police that have ever more intrusive control over the private lives of people with children. And yet they are not subject to the limitations we place on the regular police in order to protect the rights of the accused. All of this started largely in poor communities and later has expanded to the middle class. Okay, so the welfare machinery is directly led to not only criminality but also criminalization. From its inception, in fact, the welfare state was justified, pardon me, not simply for the poor, but specifically for poor children. Beginning in the 19th century, a new sensitivity about child-rearing methods led to the founding of hundreds of societies for the prevention of cruelty to children, mostly in Britain and the United States. These were ostensibly private organizations at first, though according to Stephen Crayson, quote, new laws and new court decisions gave these societies extraordinary police powers to prosecute allegedly abusive and neglectful parents, remove their children, and terminate the parental rights. According to Crayson, all of this coincided, by the way, with the appearance of the feminists, who understood the subtle but extraordinary power they could acquire by politicizing children and taking control by parents. Another scholar, Marie Gottschalk, writes, quote, women's groups were integral to these child welfare campaigns, end quote. The professionalization of social work in the early 20th century was initiated largely by feminists like Jane Addams. This quickly created an army of family functionaries with a vested interest in other people's children. The government essentially at this point was taking charitable work away from the churches and turning social workers into bureaucrats with extraordinary police powers, in Crayson's words. Previously, social workers had been largely church women who did this largely out of the goodness of their hearts. By turning them into bureaucrats, of course, they suddenly developed an interest not in solving the problem, but in creating more of the problem that they're supposed to be solving, as Reverend Shaw gave us another example of earlier. Obviously, the sexual revolution in the 1960s added fuel to this fire. It glorified sexual freedom, and it disdained traditional institutions like marriage. Okay, this created a bonanza for the family gendarmerie, social workers, to divide and rule the nation's families, and a nightmare, obviously, for the children and the parents. Millions of whom found themselves separated from one another, and in various ways turned into semi-criminals. Again, Stephen Crayson's words, quote, contemporary feminism emerged at roughly the same time as the movement for the current child abuse laws, end quote. In the United States, as some of you probably know, this led to the Mondale Act of 1974, which provided federal financial incentives to find child abuse or to concoct it. and hence to the dreaded Child Protective Services, which is another form of plainclothes police. Similar legislation, by the way, soon followed afterwards in Canada and Britain and elsewhere with similar consequences. The legislation was followed in the 1980s by waves of child abuse hysteria that swept America and Britain and other countries. The ACLU called it a witch hunt in one case in Wenatchee, Washington. And they showed how parents of both genders, though more often fathers, were unjustly deprived of their children. While the media and civil liberties organizations, like the ACLU, by the way, looked the other way. These witch hunts, social workers badgered very young children until they came up with lurid tales after having initially denied that these things occurred. All of them turned out to be complete fabrications. In each case, the pattern is familiar. And in fact, Cresson's description of the modus operandi with its presumption of guilt and other due process violations fits, and this is something I want to emphasize here, that the methods used by these child protective services have since been used and copied elsewhere in our society, in the courts, in divorce cases, in child support cases, and more recently in the larger politics. So this is Cresson's scheme of how the process works. Authorities presume, number one, authorities presume that the parents are guilty and must prove their innocence. Number two, even when it becomes clear that no abuse or neglect is taking place, they still persist in trying to find something. Number three, they improperly keep cases open, investigations open, and coerce false confessions of guilt. Or if it's a criminal investigation, a plea bargain, with a threat that the children will not be returned otherwise. Number four, parents have long struggles getting their children back, even after they are exonerated. And number five, after their nightmarish battles with the agencies are over, they find that they have no legal recourse because of the immunity, as we saw. Okay. So none of the prosecutors, judges, or social workers who ignore the due process protections or railroad innocent parents into jail in some cases are ever punished or prosecuted for the lives they destroyed. Actually, one of them, Janet Reno, was made Attorney General of the United States. On the contrary, they have complete immunity, as we saw in the film, from prosecution. But even more seriously than the immunity, these occasional exposés, and there have been exposés, there have been scholars in the media who have launched exposés about these abuses, when these waves of abuses, the Wenatchee, Washington one, the Eden, North Carolina, the one in the north of England, the Cleveland case in England. They have, and then it goes away. There's an expose, everybody scandalized, and it goes away because there's never any in-depth investigation, official investigation or others, as to why it happens in the first place, or to making sure it doesn't happen again. So it just keeps happening because nobody ever undertakes to understand why it happened. And this is, by the way, it's happened in England too. If they come up with recommendations, if there was an investigation, the famous Baby Peter case in England, they came up with a trial. In England, this is also notorious. There's actually better media coverage there of innocent parents having their children taken away. Alongside of that, real child abuse happens without the social workers detecting it. So the question comes up: what can we do about this? Well, the recommendation is invariably give us more money. So it continues. At least since the 1980s, scholars like Douglas Besharov have warned about a flood of unfounded reports that endangered abused children, truly abused children. Let's see, even the Children's Defense Fund said there's an anti-family bias that pervades the policies and practices of the child welfare system. Quote, children have been inappropriately removed from their families. A California commission concluded that children have been unnecessarily removed from their parents in staggering proportions. Quote, the state foster care system runs contrary to the preservation of families by unnecessarily removing an increased number of children from their homes each year. David Bove, a California attorney, writes that children everywhere are often removed from their parents without a warrant when one should be obtained. Parents are often tricked or intimidated, Courts, too, often rubber stamp CPS recommendations, and hearings are confidentially held, end quote. Sorry, that's not the end quote. There is no public access and little media scrutiny. Once in the system, parents are well on their way to losing their parental rights, end quote. A few years later, a California grand jury investigation revealed, quote, a system out of control with few checks and little balance, end quote. They wrote that confidential files, closed courts, gag orders, and total statutory immunity has isolated itself to a degree unprecedented in our system of jurisprudence and ordered liberties, end quote. So there's documentation of this. There's even official documentation of all of this. One scholar writes today, this is Crayson, the experience of facing false charges can happen to any parent merely by a stranger picking up the telephone and anonymously calling a well-publicized hotline number or local children's services and so forth. These are things most of you know, but these things, this has been documented. Crayson cites statistics showing massive numbers of children and families each year have been victims of this. I can go into some of the studies. I don't want to take too much time with this. Mary Pride, a private scholar, looked into the observance of basic due process protections by child abuse statutes in the U.S., such as the right to know the accusation against one, to a jury trial, to examine the evidence, and to challenge it. She found that parents had none of these protections in 31 states, and all of these protections in 0 states. Yes. Only one state even permitted a jury trial. Parents had no right of appeal, she found. They had no right to confront their accusers. And again, this is very similar to what we're seeing nowadays with rape accusations on the universities and domestic violence accusations in the divorce courts. There's no presumption of innocence. Parents must prove their innocence against an accusation of something that, like child abuse and like child support and domestic violence, has no definition. There's no definition. There's no agreed upon definition of child abuse. So how can you prosecute it? How can you defend yourself against it? The same is true of domestic violence, and the same is true of even of violations of child support. Obviously, this violates the Fourth Amendment's prohibition on illegal searches and seizures as well. And this is, again, what Crayson writes about the child abuse statutes, and you can make the same case about domestic violence, about rape, about bullying, about many of these other new crimes. Nowhere in the law are there clear-cut definitions of what is encompassed by these terms, child abuse and child neglect. Okay? The problem of definition has been a quote, this is a quotation, the problem of definition has been a major reason for an ongoing explosion of false abuse and neglect reports. So if you can't defend the crime, if you can't define the crime, how can you accuse somebody of it? But even more seriously, how can you defend yourself against something when you don't know what you're being accused of? Okay, this goes back to habeas corpus, to the Magna Carta. You have to know the charges against you. You can't be accused of nebulous things that have no definition, or that can be redefined at any time. So the other consequence of this is that you have to be very skeptical and cautious about any government statistics that claim to document child abuse or domestic violence or rape. Child abuse is seldom adjudicated as violent assault, so no objective measure exists of its frequency. Vague definitions mean that we don't really even know what we're talking about. What is it? What are we collecting statistics on if we don't have any definition of the alleged crime? Okay, none of the statistics that we read from the federal government that purport to quantify child abuse are based on convictions in jury trials or even court actions. Even those that are classified as confirmed or substantiated, which these terms basically have no meaning because there's no definition. How can we say if they're substantiated? They're not substantiated in a court. They're not substantiated by or at least they're not substantiated before a jury, I should say. Okay, they're based on reports by social workers, and some of them represent nothing more than interviews conducted by social workers with non-specialists about alleged abuse that they ended up choosing not to report. Okay, So much of the literature on child abuse comes from government, of course from governments, and from government-funded scholars and advocacy groups. Okay, so it's very, very questionable, even what we're discussing about when we read the statistics about it. So when to take an action against parents is left to the subjective determination of the social workers. As Crayson writes, existing standards set no limits on intervention and provide no guidelines for decision making. It is up to the social workers to decide what is meant by abuse and neglect. Okay, so it's like allowing the police to decide what constitutes a crime. So the police get to define a crime, and then they get to arrest you for it. If that's what was happening, as you can imagine, we would have a police state. But that is what's happening in the child protection industry. It's a direct violation of the separation of powers. That's why one branch of government makes the laws, and another branch of government enforces the laws. But not in this case. Okay. The foster care system, as many of you know, into which children are placed, have levels of abuse up to 10 times more the rate of physical abuse and more than 28 times the rate of sexual abuse as that of the general population. Again, this is so the very existence of social work profession blurs the distinction between police and between social work and law enforcement. And this has been documented too. Our former head of the Children's Bureau, Susan Orr, wrote that although spoken in terms of social services, Susan Orr wrote, the child protection function of child welfare is essentially a police action. Okay? Yet because they're not called police, they're not limited, and they don't wear uniforms, and they're not limited by the usual requirements, restrictions that we put on police to observe and respect civil liberties. And Orr calls the Child Protective Services, quote, the most intrusive arm of social services. But she also points out that because parents are seldom charged formally with physical assault, they don't have a chance to ever formally clear their names. This is also true of domestic violence accusations, by the way. You're not usually charged with physical assault, so you never get your day in court. You don't get a chance to clear your name, but they simply take away your children, which is the purpose in both the case of both domestic violence and child abuse accusations. By the way, both Orr and Crayson recommend, and I concur with this, that the best remedy for this, one of the best remedies for all of these false accusations, is to formally charge people with a crime. In other words, if you abuse your children, if you commit physical assault on a child, that's physical assault. You should be accused of it. If you batter your spouse, that's physical assault. You should be accused of a crime, and you should get your day in court in front of a jury and a chance to clear your name. But this blurs that distinction. These are not adjudicated like crimes. They're adjudicated often in family courts, which are not criminal courts. Similarly, rape accusations, they're not in universities, they're not adjudicated in real courts. Students are never charged with rape. But they're brought before a tribunal, a false tribunal, of professors, administrators, and students who pretend to be a court. So the remedy for this oftentimes is to draw a sharp distinction between what is a crime and what is not a crime. If it's a crime, charge them with a crime, whether they're parents or spouses or students, and if they're guilty, you punish them in a jail, and if they're innocent, you leave them alone. Most people understand this. This is not a difficult principle to understand in a free society. But instead, we blur the distinction. Well, we're not going to put you, and they justify this by the fact that you don't usually face jail sentence if you're accused of child abuse, domestic violence, or rape in a university. Your children are taken away, or you're thrown out of the university, or that. So they justify this ignoring the due process protection because they say, well, you're not in criminal jeopardy. We're not going to put you in jail. We're just going to take your children away. Well, most parents, of course, given the choice between having their children taken away and going to jail, of course, it would be no choice at all. They would most gladly choose a jail sentence over losing their children. So the sentence is far more severe. It's not any less so. Also, like divorce proceedings, and like the other accusations I discussed, child protection blurs the distinction between civil and criminal law. Okay, in theory, it's a civil. Many of these are civil offenses, but in practice, the penalties end up being criminal. And as a number of speakers have mentioned, I think, elsewhere, even if you are exonerated in the film, even if you are exonerated in a criminal court of child abuse, you can still you aren't necessarily giving your children back. Okay, so you can have a day in court, you can be exonerated, you can be found not guilty of child abuse, and you still have to battle the family court or the social service agencies to get your children back. Even if parents are exonerated in a criminal court, writes Quayson, and proceedings against them in the juvenile and family and civil courts may still go on ahead. Criminal exoneration is no guarantee that they will get their children back. So where does this authority come from? The other thing, and this isn't just parents that are threatened by this. Okay? These are basic violations of basic civil liberties of and due process of law, and this isn't going to be contained in the family courts or the social service agencies. As Martin Luther King said, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere. And the injustice will spread to all of us. It will poison all of our civil liberties. It will poison all of the judiciary if this is allowed to continue. One of the ways this is already starting, of course, is forcing citizens to be informers against one another, much like in totalitarian societies, where people in communist societies, where citizens were forced to inform upon their fellows. And mandatory reporting by doctors and other professionals of even suspected child abuse, whatever that might be, and complete immunity means that they can make anonymous accusations, or they must make anonymous accusations, for which they, without necessarily any evidence. So as Crayson writes, much as in totalitarian regimes, the laws that we have created a system driven by fear. Physicians, teachers, daycare workers, mandated reporters make reports, often at the slightest pretext, because they figure that it's better to speak up than not to speak up for the sake of self-protection. Some U.S. states mandate that every citizen must report even suspected child abuse. Okay, and federal legislation has been introduced to make the requirement mandatory across the country. So it's very strange. Mandating, making criminal penalties, okay, for failing to report something that has no definition. This is madness. Yeah, he says this is a police state. Well, obviously it is. Every citizen will be forced to act as an informer against friends, family, and neighbors, or face possible charges. And again, these courts often operate in secrecy, as with divorce courts do as well. It's very strange. They often say, you ask, why are they operating in secret? The Constitution, of course, requires open justice, open courts. But these courts operate in secret. Well, the rationalization is that they operate in secret to protect family privacy. As I've said myself before, they don't protect family privacy. They act as a cloak. Secrecy acts as a cloak to violate family privacy with impunity. And since I wrote that once, I found somebody else who said the same thing. I forget where I quoted this from. But confidentialities are supposed to protect kids. They were supposed to protect families. Instead, they provide a basis for assaulting them. Very true. Now, there's one thing here I want to emphasize because it is not well known, and it's oftentimes misunderstood, or at least people want to avoid this reality. And even at conferences like this, I hear people often repeating the buzzwords and the cliches of the radical ideology. And even though I agree with the people in the film who said that federal money is behind this, it certainly is behind it. And there's also power, political power of the state that's behind it. But there's also a very strong ideological component to this. Much of this is driven by ideological, radical feminist ideology. And when you repeat feminist ideology, you are many times playing into the hands of your enemies and those who've taken away your children. The social work profession was started, once again, as a profession, was created by Marxist feminists like Jane Addams. And today, social workers who perpetrate these actions are steeped in feminist ideology. They are trained in universities in ideological subjects like gender studies, women's studies, and queer studies. And there's no profession that allows them to apply these ideological theories more in practice, more than does the field of social work. So no one should doubt the ideological subtext. As Christina Hoff Sommers writes, the abuse therapists were joined by an influential group of conspiracy-minded feminists. She herself considers herself a dissident feminist. But she points out that when a few civil libertarian feminists tried to blow the whistle on the witch hunt, they were vilified by the conspiracy caucus as backlashers, child abuse apologists, and obedient daddy's girls of male editors. Hoff Sommers is one of the few, end quote, Hoff Sommers is one of the few scholars I've come across who have noticed the similarities between these different forms of accusations, child abuse accusations, and accusations of things like rape against men. She writes, quote, today's college rape epidemic is an eerie recapitulation of the daycare abuse panic. Just as the mythical 50,000 abducted children fueled paranoia about child safety in the 1980s, so today's hysteria is incited by the constantly repeated, equally fictitious 1 in 5 women on campus is a victim of rape, which even President Obama has embraced, end quote. So even a few, so it's interesting because we have scholars that investigate one of these hoaxes and we have scholars that investigate another hoax. Very few of them have drawn the parallel, which I'm trying to do today, to show you the larger pattern of what's going on here. But here again is Hoff Sommers, where she sees very clearly. She says, once again, conspiracy feminists are at the forefront of this movement. Just as feminist psychologists persuaded children that they had been abused, so women's activists have persuaded many young women that what they might have dismissed as a foolish drunken hookup was actually a felony rape. Believe the children, said the ritual abuse experts during the daycare scare. Believe the survivors, say today's rape culturalists. To not believe an alleged victim is to risk being called a rape apologist. So it's very, again, I think we need to look at the larger pattern here. But it's possible to go, I think, even further here. Because the crowning irony of the child abuse epidemic, or the child abuse hysteria, is that the Child Protective Services are often unable to protect children from real child abuse. Again, the Baby Peter case in England was a good example of this. And in many ways, I think one way to think of this is that we have not really eliminated child abuse so much as we have bureaucratized it and politicized it. For in many ways, the whole child abuse phenomenon is entirely a creation of the welfare bureaucracies themselves. And this is in some ways a textbook example of government creating a problem for itself to solve. And this is, Reverend Shaw has made a similar point earlier about the drugging of children. It's very similar in a way. And there's many examples of this you could cite from across many policy areas, but very few that have such serious consequences. Child abuse is almost, we've already heard about how much child abuse takes place in the foster care system, where they're supposed to be protected. But child care abuse is almost entirely a phenomenon of single-parent homes. The massive growth of child abuse coincides directly with the sexual revolution and the divorce revolution and the development of fatherless and motherless homes. In other words, and this is a pattern that's worth emphasizing, the most effective protection against child abuse is an intact family. It's often said by anthropologists that the weakest link in the family is the father. So usually the father is the first one to be removed. And then often the mother is removed as well, but it usually begins with the father. So the children first become fatherless, and in terms of quantity, it's the vast majority. But then also, sometimes the mother is removed as well, and the children end up in foster care. And of course, it is also the father that feminist social workers hate more than anyone else and love to remove. Okay, so from the father's perspective, it would appear that the real child abusers have thrown him out of the family so that they can abuse his children with impunity. And in some ways, that's the same perspective, I'm sure, with mothers who lose their children to foster care. So seldom, in conclusion, does public policy stand in such direct defiance of undisputed truths, to the point where the cause of the problem, separating children from their fathers and their parents, is presented as the solution. And the solution, allowing children to have their fathers and their mothers, is depicted as the problem. Okay? So if you want children to be abused, break up their families, separate them from their fathers and from their mothers as well. So the logic is marvelously self-justifying and self-perpetuating. By eliminating the fathers in the divorce courts, by the way, so this is another way in which this is linked up together, all this is interlinked. By eliminating the fathers in the divorce courts, officials can present themselves as the solution to the problem they themselves have created. The more child abuse, whether it's by single mothers or boyfriends or foster care providers or even by the social workers themselves, which is often the case, the more the calls come to expand the child abuse bureaucracy. Thank you. So each problem caused, and again, this parallels what Reverend Charles said earlier, each problem caused calls for more government machinery that creates the problem in the first place. Okay, whether it's removing the father from the home, establishing the visitation center, where he can see his children only under surveillance of social workers, whether it's protecting the children from the abusive foster care system, or treating the emotionally devastated children with drugs or psychotherapy, or removing them altogether into foster care and later juvenile detention facilities. The solution for each problem is to create more of the machinery that causes the problem in the first place. Okay, so we have a government perpetual growth machine. And this is a commonplace of political science, of my field, that bureaucracies relentlessly expand, often by creating the very problem they're supposed to be solving. So, it's not surprising that this is happening. It doesn't involve conspiracy theorists. It doesn't involve, I'm not arguing there's a little cabal of evil social workers there that are looking up to take away all of our children. When you break the basic rules that children should be raised by their mother and their father and their intact family, once you deviate from that, you invite problems. And unless you're going to go back to that, you invite problems. The only solution is to create more government machinery, which creates more problems. Just to summarize briefly, since the beginning, we've seen the child abuse hysteria. We've seen this spread to other areas of the law, and I could name other areas beyond these, but basically domestic violence accusations came along, and then after that, of course, the rape accusations in the universities, and today we're seeing this in the Hollywood accusations, okay, and so forth. Now, the cases of Kavanaugh, Cosby, and Weinstein, and so forth. Now, does this mean that all the figures in these cases are innocent, as are, in fact, many accused parents are innocent? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're innocent. Everyone is innocent. Okay, after all, I've shown that I've allowed that child abuse in some cases is real. Okay, the point is not that child abuse does not happen, but that these ill-defined new offenses, like sexual harassment and sexual assault, those too. I'm not saying they never happen. Okay, the point is that the accusers are creating the problem and then capitalizing on it to increase their power. Okay, this is arguably the case with accusers of Me Too as well. Since whether the men are innocent or guilty or somewhere in between, the entire phenomenon is the product of the sexual revolution and its demands for unlimited sexual freedom. And when you mix this with things like universities and the work schools and the workplaces, this can't help but produce large number. It's a prescription for trouble. Men are going to turn into sexual adventurers. Women are going to be forced into positions of something like semi-prostitutes. Government officials are going to become essentially improvised prosecutors, including school officials and so forth, improvised police and prosecutors. And all of us are going to attain the status of potential criminals. That's where I see we're at. Thank you for your attention. I'll stop there. And